Welcome to the 11th annual Wege Foundation's series, and it's funny because I'm writing my second book, and in it it's called Economicology, the 11th commandment, so it fit right in today. I'm pleased to introduce you to Denis Hayes. Whether you know it or not, the lives of everyone in this room have been touched by Denis Hayes. In 1970, when he was 24 years old, Denis was the national coordinator for the first Earth Day. I was there in Washington, D.C. I think it was in the foyer of the Mayflower, I think it was anyhow, hotel, when Senator Gaylord Nelson spoke to a large gathering in the hotel lobby. That day there was about 1 million people that started the whole movement going of the environmental areas. It went up and down for a few years, but now they've really learned how to do it. It took them about 40 years to do it. More than 20 million participated in the first Earth Day, and Denis has worked to inspire and mobilize hundreds of millions more as founder and chair of the Earth Day Network. In naming him one of its heroes for the planet, Time magazine called Denis Mr. Earth Day, but he didn't know I was standing in the foyer of that hotel the day that Gaylord Nelson was on. So there was a lot of heroes on that day, right? More than 20. Let's see. Denis has long been a pioneer in the field of clean energy. At the young age of 35, he was appointed by President Jimmy Carter to head the Solar Energy Research Institute. Since then, he's been a professor at Stanford University, a Silicon Valley lawyer, and many years now president of the Bullitt Foundation in Seattle, Washington. I'm sure that Denis must have known a friend of mine, John Gardner, who I met at an environmental conference in Sun Valley, Idaho. John was, I think, emeritus there at the college. Denis Hayes has been awarded the highest awards offered by the Sierra Club, National Wildlife Federation, National Resource Council of America, American Solar Energy Society, and the Human Society of the United States, and Aquinas College. I just added that one. At the Bullitt Foundation, Denis' goal is to make the Pacific Northwest a global model for sustainability development in the most environmentally aware region in America. Well, he's going to have a lot to do with that area, but I told him that Grand Rapids is 12%. He'd have to go over that. We're 12% environmentally friendly in this area. Denis, at the Wege Foundation, our motto is "Go Blue, Think Green." And here in West Michigan, we all give you some friendly competition for the honor of leading the United States to a more sustainable energy future. And you can borrow one of my slogans anytime you like, which is drop your ego and grab your eco. Okay? Please welcome Denis.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that. Oh, I'm in stereo here. Can I turn this one off? Is that better? Yeah. For that marvelous introduction, John Gardner was, in fact, a very dear friend of mine. We actually launched the Earth Day organization out of the headquarters of the Urban Coalition and served as a mentor for much of my life. Was on the board of directors of Earth Day 1990 when we took it international to 144 countries. And speaking of international, Peter Wege, as some of you, but probably not all of you know, is often credited as the person mostly responsible for setting aside 2% of the total land area of Costa Rica, representing about 3% of all the biodiversity in the world for posterity. So if we had 30 more men like Peter Wege, we'd be there. This is my first trip to Grand Rapids. I've been as close as Kalamazoo in Lansing. Actually, my father began his career with something called Kalamazoo Vegetable Parchment, KVP, which I think is a fancy way to say Kalamazoo paper a long time, almost a century ago. But now that I've made the final leap, I'm thrilled to be here. This is a city that, as you probably know, has a reputation that extends well beyond you. The city with, per capita, the largest number of LEED-certified buildings in the United States, and your much admired sustainability partnership. And I'm particularly delighted that Mayor George Hartwell has signed the U.S. Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement, which we actually launched out in Seattle, the friendly rivalry continuing. There have been some Beltway bandits and pundits rather, who've scoffed at this initiative. They have a view that everything has to emanate from Capitol Hill to be worthwhile. But as of last Friday, 431 mayors representing more than 61 million Americans had signed up. Their cities release more CO2 than the nations of England, France, the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Scotland, and Ireland combined. I did a back-of-the-envelope calculation that I would not want to wager a huge sum on, but at least for rough numbers, I think that the city of Grand Rapids itself contributes more CO2 than the countries of Andorra and Monaco, actually about 4 times as much. So all of these things really do add up, and once you get to have 431 cities, you've got a pretty good chunk of America. This has been a source of reassurance to people around the world who want to love and admire Americans and who've been disappointed in us much in recent years, that even when the national government is not responding very well to a huge crisis, we still have the grassroots capacity to do that. I'm going to be trying to do something that has a lot of variables in it here today. Some of it's almost certainly not going to work. I hope that you're tolerant people. One, I'm trying a brand new technology. I've never had this kind of really super fancy remote before. And Marty kept telling me time after time, whatever you do, don't touch that button. And I know somewhere in here that button's going to get touched. Like Peter, I'm also writing a book, and a portion of this thing is going to be, for the first time, running up the flagpole, a set of ideas that's currently a draft chapter in the book. If you start giggling, it will cease to be a draft chapter in the book. Whereas if you respond enthusiastically, then I may develop it a little bit more. In any case, let's get started. It's pretty easy to say that energy, and in particular oil, have now come to be fairly much in the visible public spotlight. But say 5 years ago, they weren't. There's a pretty clear reason for that. The formatting from my Mac to the PC didn't come across just perfectly, but you can at least get the numbers. 2002, oil was $22. 1998, it was under $12 a barrel. It is really difficult to convince Americans that petroleum era is in its last hours when they're paying $12 a gallon, maybe $1.50, $12 a barrel, $1.50 a gallon for gasoline. But in the last few years, this has skyrocketed upward and thrown a whole bunch of issues into base relief. The administration's energy policy is in fact an oil policy. This is a chart that you often see. People, I've heard on numerous occasions, people refer to that whole shaded area as America's energy consumption. It's not. That's America's oil consumption. It's about 40% of America's energy consumption. And that little red nudge down at the bottom is what an optimistic assessment says we might be able to get out of the Arctic refuge. That has been, by far, the dominant energy proposal to come out of the Bush administration in 6 years. Which is how I think of In a trip to Britain, I came across this marvelous thing that says that this issue will quickly be behind us, and came up with this interesting question, which was framed by the evangelicals not so long ago. What would Jesus drive? And, of course, Jesus would have walked. But a much more interesting question is, what would Satan drive? And here it is. And what is most upsetting about this is that although Toyota has already run through all of the tax credits that are available for Priuses in the United States, so you no longer get any benefit except the market benefits of owning one. You can still obtain an incredibly handsome, provided you use it in your business, federal subsidy up to 3/4 of the cost of one of these monsters, paid for by the U.S. taxpayers. This stuff has lots of implications for national security, for balances of payments, for what have you. This is a quick chart that shows what it means for climate change. Up at the top, a typical Hummer, 10 miles per gallon. If you go over to that far right column up at the top, oh, try this button. That was the right one, good. Up there, compared to an EV1, which were crushed and taken out of the marketplace after being introduced in California and Arizona, the difference between 27 and 0.2 is, of course, a pretty stunning difference. And even as you move into what I think will be the next generation of vehicles, the second from the bottom, the PHEV, with the 50-mile electric vehicle range, that's in essence what General Motors is talking about in its new prototype at the last Detroit Auto Fair, the Volt automobile. 0.4 versus 27.3. Stunning sort of differences. And having edged a little bit into climate, this is a chart, the top 3 of which many of you have seen before because it's become a commonplace way of summarizing what the principal conclusions were of the International Panel on Climate Change. In 1990, we'd been saying by that time, for quite some time, that the Earth was warming. The question was, why is it warming? Is it going to be fluctuating? And it has this very moderate statement that it could be due to natural variability. It could be due to something that humans are causing. It's entirely possible that humans are doing something that actually masks the greater extent of greenhouse warming. By 1995, we're up to the balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence. By 2001, new and stronger evidence that most warming observed is attributable to humans. And then finally this year, that most of the observed increase in global temperatures since the mid-20th century is very likely, which they define as being greater than 90%. They're scientists, it will never be 100%, but that's about as high as you're going to get, due to the observed increase of anthropogenic greenhouse gas concentrations. Anthropogenic is just a fancy way of saying human-caused. I'm not going to be giving you a global warming slide presentation. Al Gore has made that impossible for anybody to ever do again. But do want to point out this interesting one, which just shows that they always give a range. And if you go back to the IPCC projections over time, we have, in all of the major things that we've been observing since then, from the rise of oceans to the temperature change to what have you, we've been at the upper edge of their projections. On a couple of items, we've actually been higher than was projected by IPCC, with certain kinds of very sad implications for some of our friends on the planet. There seems to be, I'm afraid, an excellent chance that polar bears in the wild will simply no longer exist within the next 30 to 40 years. And partly as a result of trying to address that issue with biofuels, including setting up palm oil plantations for biodiesel down in Indonesia, we may well be wiping out orangutans, at least in the wild, in that same rough period of time. A number of us, together with the World Wildlife Fund, have mounted a fairly major campaign against that particular thing right now. This is my favorite cartoon about climate change. You all saw the interesting instance where the fellow from Exxon kept editing these things as counsel to the White House Council on Environmental Quality. And it comes down to global warming is no big deal. Have a nice day. Beautifully done. Okay, what should we be doing at this point? If we're to avoid the unmanageable, that's to say, if we're going to avoid having a temperature change in the 2 to 2.5 degree C level, that's the point where the IPCC says that you're going to see you will clearly see very major instabilities in the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic, the West Antarctic ice sheet. Then you have to stop before 450 to 500 parts per million of CO2 compared to 380 today. That means that global CO2 emissions have to peak no later than, say, 2020, at not too much above their current levels and begin to decline. Everybody knows, everybody forgets, and needs to be reminded that CO2 emissions are cumulative. So every year adds on to what you put in the year before. And hence, It would seem like we've got a decent margin between 380 and 450, but in fact, every year that you add a few more parts per million, you get deeper and deeper into that hole. And the state at which it is pulled out by natural processes is sort of in geological periods of time. This is how we're responding to it with various measures, none of which have passed the U.S. Congress. And it was really a wonderful piece of analysis. I serve on the board of the organization that did this, the World Resources Institute. It shocked a great many people who think of themselves as fairly ardent environmentalists how ineffective their proposals would be, including Jeff Bingaman, the head of the Senate Energy Committee, and Mark Udall, who's an ardent environmentalist out of Colorado. And even as all of that's going on, the fellow who's an analyst with the American Association for the Advancement of Science did this assessment of federal research in constant uninflated dollars in climate change. And it turns out over time, the research in this field has actually been declining. If you look at those individual components, there are a bunch of interesting things there, including the growth in commerce. Let's try if I can find this again. That purple swatch there. We're paying much more attention to what its impact will be upon the national economy and the global economy, but the thing that absolutely dominates the charts is this yellow thing. That's NASA research. Undoubtedly governed somewhat by the fact that many NASA researchers have been very outspoken on this, with peer-reviewed published papers that have said it's much more serious much earlier than key members of the administration wanted to believe. And as a consequence, NASA's budget has been kind of taking it hard. This is the way that our political cartoonists have responded to that, and it's a very poor drawing of Jim Hansen there on the right. Okay, so what is the task ahead of us? We look at commercial energy today. It's about 12.5 terawatts. The goal for 2050 that I'm going to be working with today, at least, is 25 terawatts. That's a good deal lower than many people use. It would require absolutely heroic investments in efficiency in the developed world, but still allows for significant growth in poor nations. In essence, it means that the average person in the world in 2050 will be using about 1/5 as much commercial energy. That's energy that gets measured as the average American uses today. I focus on the energy that gets measured because the world is part of a huge energy system, most of which we don't pay any attention to. I mean, if you throw your clothes in a clothes dryer and natural gas or electricity dry them, then that's measured energy. If you put them on a clothesline, it takes just as much energy to dry them, but we don't pay any attention to that. And of course, sunlight powers the hydrological cycle and the carbon cycle and the great engines of the planet. But 1/5 as much of the commercial energy as we currently measure it. Doing an assessment of renewable resources, some people are optimistic about hydroelectric. We've done a fair amount of study as to what's possible up there. It looks like the economic thing is less than a terawatt. We currently have 0.8 terawatts, which is to say, with anything like current economics, we're pretty much there with hydro already. However, hydropower has very seldom been limited by economic rationality, and the odds are we're actually going to build a fair number more dams. Politicians particularly like to build dams and name them after themselves, and this will be, I think, fairly common in parts of the developing world. I'm guessing this will probably be between 1 and 1.5 terawatts. Remember, the object here is to total ourselves up to 25. Biomass. If you were to do just about everything that you could possibly do and still grow some food, it's in the 7 to 10 terawatt range. More likely, given that the world population, even if we slammed the brakes on the population explosion, and nobody even has a clue what slammed the brakes on the population explosion means, except maybe the Chinese, but their approach to it is one that is not universally applauded, is going to get to be at least 8 billion and probably more likely something on the order of 9 or 10 billion, unless there is some catastrophic event, a pandemic, flu, a thermonuclear exchange, something. So let's assume that we're going to have 10 billion people and they're all going to try to eat a little bit higher on the food pyramid than most people in the developing world do today. Almost all of that population growth is going to take place in countries that are not agriculturally self-sufficient. In fact, Les Brown has calculated that China will have eaten its entire grain reserve, be basically running on an annual basis, by the end of 2007. If that's true, it will need to probably import in 2008 more grain than Canada will produce. And if you're ever going between food and energy, people are going to be choosing food, or at least I'd like to think they will. So let's assume that we can get up to 5 terawatts. I should say this is sometimes rejected by people who are biofuel enthusiasts as not sufficiently optimistic. But this is a huge number. That's more energy than we get out of natural gas today, almost as much energy as the world gets out of oil today. I think it's going to be remarkable if we actually hit that. Wind, again, you've got all kinds of things. We're never going to tap most of the wind out there. If you get to the wind, it's on top of Mount Everest. It's in Antarctica. It's in the Aleutians, in the middle of the Pacific. Others are in avian flyways or in places of cultural significance to various groups. I think 3 to 4 terawatts there is, again, a pretty optimistic assessment. That's still talking about 25 years of robust growth for the wind industry, probably 50% a year to get up to 4 terawatts. But again, within a 25 terawatt budget, it's an important contributor. Geothermal, if you go down 3 or 4 miles, you can get a lot. There are a huge number of technical problems involved in doing that. I say 2 terawatts. Virtually nobody that I hang around with in the energy community agrees with that. Almost all of them think that that number is too high by a factor of 2. So you add all those things together and you get about as much energy as we use today. And that leaves us with 12.5 terawatts that's needed and 3 things that we've got today that can get us there: coal, nuclear, and solar. I was told to give an upbeat presentation here today. And that means I'm not going to talk much about coal and nuclear. Suffice it to say that there's no way to get the energy out of coal without producing carbon dioxide. There are ways to capture and sequester carbon dioxide. Probably not ways to do it that are going to be geologically stable for long enough periods of time to make it a really big contributor in the long run. And we're talking terawatts. The amount of CO2 that's going out today from conventional fuels is larger than the volume of Lake Michigan. And pressurizing all of this stuff and putting it in geologically stable areas, some of it's certainly going to be done. You can judge for yourself how likely you think that that will be a terawatt contributor. I think if we go with coal, ultimately it's going with the CO2 contributor. We'll just do it somewhat more efficiently. With nuclear, there's no way to get power out of an atom that you can't also get a bomb out of. There is nothing that Iran has even been accused of doing that is not an inherent part of building a complete nuclear fuel cycle. So if you've got all of the necessary isotopes and you've got the necessary know-how, if you have a heavily nuclear economy, then you're going to have bombs. And I don't think there's anybody in our increasingly globalized world that thinks that America can rely upon an energy source that we are unprepared to share with everybody else, at least not for a significant fraction of our energy. I said I wasn't going to be saying much about it. Let's just leave it that nuclear and coal will both play a role in the future. My hope is that they will be relatively modest roles. But then that leaves us with this huge problem. I've gone through the other renewables. You can get some stuff out of tidal, and you can get some stuff out of waves. But of the big players out there, what's left is solar. And it's, of course, an enormous player. We currently receive like 500 times as much energy from the sun as we use for all purposes. I'm going to run through a whole series of these things relatively rapidly, mostly because I hadn't realized until I got here that you have a solar installation, a 10 kilowatt installation here on campus. So all of you have seen solar. If you were taking the bullet train from Tokyo to Osaka, this is a huge installation that you'd go by that Sanya was put up there using their own cells and powering the facility behind it with it. But the rest of the world has just been, particularly Japan and Germany, has just been going wild on solar of late. So I'll run through a series of buildings where the solar has been actually integrated into the building design. Won't make any comments about this. This one's interesting. It's in Korea. This is Samsung. This one's in Holland. Interesting. They do a lot of these barrel facilities in Europe. I haven't seen many of them in this country. This is a Shell research headquarters. This is a fire station that uses passive solar design for heating and cooling and has the entire roof covered with photovoltaic arrays, but coated in this matrix that actually allows light to pass through as well as getting the energy off of it. This is an interesting building. It's a 1 megawatt solar installation that has 5 buildings inside. It was put together by an architect from southern France who wanted to know if in northern Germany she could get roughly the same climactic elements that she would have if she were, say, in Nice. And in fact, she does. They've geared this thing so that there's an instrument in Nice measuring the temperature, and it goes into this building and controls louvers on the roof and other things to try to have the building be the same as Nice is. So you can find yourself there in February and look up, and the roof has all of these slats. And even you can be a little bit chilly. But it's because the temperature in Nice that day happens to be 65 degrees, and in her effort to duplicate Nice, this building has to be chilled down to 65 degrees, where it could actually be warmer than that, even in cloudy Germany. And, of course, a megawatt of photovoltaics up on the roof. This is another view of the same building. This is something that you never see in the United States, but are increasingly seeing in Austria, in Switzerland, in Holland. It's photovoltaic arrays on the north side of freeways, put on sound barriers and other kinds of walls to protect freeways. Because they're already there, they just have to have them at the right angle for the latitude that they're at, and it's a free backing for them. This is something in Sacramento, California that's been there. It's an interesting thing because in Sacramento it's really hot in the summer, and people wanted to have shade, and it turned out if you're going to be putting all that shade up there, you might as well be getting some value out of it. You had the flat roofs, and so they covered them with PV panels. Here's a similar sort of thing in El Segundo. That's just south of, it's actually part of the greater Los Angeles metropolitan area. And there they're using the sunlight to split water and get hydrogen and put it in their trucks. This is at a winery. That's actually that same 1 megawatt building that I told you about before. This is integrating it into churches. This is integrating it into the Reichstag. That was actually at a time that Ronald Reagan was ripping the photovoltaic arrays off the White House for reasons that have always left me absolutely bewildered. What in the world is the message in that? The Germans were installing them on their Capitol. Here's another one of these barrel things and just running through. This is a nice kind of integrated solar system where I put regular shingles on the sides. I'm not entirely sure why, but if you've got aesthetic things within your a zoning ordinance or aesthetic covenants in the area that you live in, they're getting increasingly solar in a variety of colors, a variety of shapes that can be integrated into buildings with ways that are virtually invisible. In Germany, where they've got a feed-in tariff, they have a whole lot of times where people don't put them on their houses at all. They all get together, buy the panels, install them someplace where they can be serviced really easily, and feed the electricity into the grid and collect their money back from the grid. This is the Moscone Center in San Francisco. It's a building here on the right. And this is a building that most of you are fairly familiar with here in Aquinas College. This is a kind of an interesting development. It's windows that have photovoltaic strips woven across them. You still have a high degree of visibility between it. It gives you a degree of sunshade, but instead of simply reflecting the light, it's absorbing the light and converting a large fraction of it into electricity. So it's operable windows that are also photovoltaic. And this is an example of the new thin film technology. This one, I believe, is a CIGS system. That are hugely flexible, very, very thin, have very little material intensity, as yet not terribly efficient, maybe 8-9%. The best silicon cells are now 22%. The best laboratory things are now pushing 40%, but still really, really cheap. So we've got all of this stuff out there, and that's a relatively small fraction of the solar slides that I've collected over time. The question is, when are we going to get started doing something more serious about it in terms of 12.5 terawatts? This is an interesting slide. It's perhaps the most important slide that I'm going to show you today, although it has nothing to do with energy or with particularly solar. It's computer chips. And the interesting part of the slide is this period right down here at the bottom. There was no market whatsoever for chips during that period. The government bought a bunch of chips, drove up the volume. As they drove up the volume, the price fell, following an ordinary learning curve. And by the time you got up to the first integrated circuits, which are right up in this area someplace, it was capable of sustaining itself in the market. Moore's law really kicked in, and it just continues to go on out indefinitely off to the right, packing more and more and more transistors into ever smaller units. Yeah, I'm missing a slide here, but the slide would have showed you was what was happening to prices over that time. This is a tragedy. This shows what happened to the federal government's efforts to do the same thing for solar cells that it did for computer chips. There's a learning curve with solar cells as well. Basically, from the start, every time that we've doubled the production levels, the price has fallen by 20%, or the cost of producing them has fallen by 20%. So you get 100% more cells, and you sell it for 80% price per cell. Whoops. How did that happen? Okay. If you look right in here, in 1980 there was an election. Jimmy Carter, who had been supporting the relatively large investments there, when I will say I was in government and running the solar program, we're trying to do precisely that. We had developed something that looked exactly like the learning curve that the Department of Defense and NASA had for computer chips. And we're going to be driving it down from the relatively high prices then to a place where, as in about 1972, computer chips took off, where we expected solar cells to do much the same sort of thing. Okay, getting to 12.5 terawatts with solar is something that strikes many people as not terribly probable. As you go through history and look at these various things, there have been many of these comments by various folks saying that something is unlikely to be successful. In time after time after time, I've got an absolutely wonderful one, but I didn't have time today to show it to you, explaining in a letter from Martin Van Buren why it was absolutely necessary to set up the Interstate Commerce Commission in order to protect the canals of the country from the infringement of the railroad industry, in some large measure because God had not wanted people to go at 15 miles per hour raging across the countryside. This is perhaps the most unsuccessful of these particular predictions. At that point, there were only about 9 big computers in the world. Okay. I'm going to be going into the chapter of my book in just a couple of minutes. And before I go there, I'm going to be giving you a quick view of stuff outside the United States, and in particular at China. But I want you to remember that slide that I had up there dealing with transistor chips and solar cells, because that's in essence what I'm going to be talking about without the PowerPoint is all about. China, which is well endowed with coal, has a huge demand for energy, and is exploiting coal at a level that is just stunning. Gigawatts don't mean too much for most people, but if you think of that 100 gigawatt figure, for the number of power plants that came online in 2006, the state of California has a little over 50 gigawatts total from all sources for California. So China brought in 2 Californias worth of electricity in 1 year. 92 gigawatts of that was from coal. And we're not talking any kind of clean coal here. This is pulverized coal with no control technologies. This is the projection for where China is going in the future. You need to note this is NDRC, not NRDC. That's the Chinese governing and planning agency for this stuff. The CO2 emissions are stunning. If you compare the new coal plants in 2006, that's 1 year's worth of new emissions compared to how much Europe was required under the Kyoto commitments to reduce its CO2 emissions per year over an 18-year period. Obviously, all of Europe is stunned by 1 year of China. And yet China, because it has this 1.3 billion people, is using a trivial amount of energy per person. And I should also say that lest we think that we are virtuous because of this growth rate in China, as all of you know, we have been exporting to China not just jobs, but some of our most energy-efficient manufacturing processes, energy-consuming manufacturing processes. So as a consequence, much of what's being produced in the form of global warming in China is to feed markets in the United States and in Europe and Japan. Okay, here's the fanciest thing I will have here. This is CO2 emissions from the United States, CO2 emissions from China. These are not aggregated. They're just, view each of these lines as a separate thing. That's the interesting point. China will be passing the United States in CO2 emissions in 2009, vastly closer than most people realize. And that's the rest of OECD, other than the United States. And that's the rest of non-OECD. That's less than a fifth of the world compared to 4/5 of the world, but the developing world is growing in its CO2 emissions vastly more rapidly than OECD, though, of course, historically it's contributed very little, and the United States and the rest of the developed countries have historically contributed a huge amount. Okay, now this is the part that I really need your feedback on. This is the portion from something I'm going to be trying to convince you of from this book that I'm writing. It's a thought exercise comparing the solar revolution with the information revolution. In 1980, the year that Ronald Reagan was elected president, IBM announced that it intended to introduce a personal computer that was going to compete with Altair for the hobbyists, with Atari for games, and most important, with Apple and Commodore for general consumers. The IBM machine was finally delivered in August of 1981. It came with a whopping 64K of memory, a monochrome display, and either 1 or 2 floppy disk drives for disks that were holding 360K. It could boot up only one program at a time, which was fine because there were only 1 or 2 programs out there that anybody wanted to use. As one of the very first adopters, I got it within a month of the time it was available. I can affirm that it was not a useful machine. It was a toy. About that same time, somebody named Denis Hayes, and tragically not me, dropped out of Georgia Tech and developed a modem that allowed one's personal computer to talk to somebody else's computer on a telephone line. His first commercial model of the Hayes smart modem transmitted information at 300 bits per second. That was faster than watching grass grow, but not much. In contrast, in 1980, same year, in the renewable energy field, essentially every commercially important solar photovoltaic material had already been discovered. So had most of the fundamentals that now characterize wind turbines. We'd been experimenting with enzymatic hydrolysis to convert cellulose into ethanol, and we were applying the tools of biotechnology to that end. We'd begun to probe the frontiers of photoelectrochemistry for direct hydrogen production. We built passive solar buildings that, even in places like Denver, Colorado, required 0 net energy for heating and cooling. In a garage in Palo Alto, an engineer named John Royal from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory had already built several gasoline-electric plug-in hybrid vehicles. They're serial hybrids, just like the General Motors Volt. That's almost exactly the same approach that GM now hopes to be having on the road in 2012. And a team at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory had invented the compact fluorescent lamp. The problems that are addressable by renewable energy technologies included the increasing use of oil as a diplomatic weapon by Middle Eastern states, huge trade deficits associated with oil imports, the apparently lethal blow to the nuclear industry from the 3 Mile Island accident, and, of course, climate change. In 1980, America's renewable energy program was the envy of those in the world that were interested in renewable energy. We spent more money, employed more PhDs, generated more patents, and installed more projects than the rest of the world combined. President Carter had proclaimed the goal of obtaining 20% of the nation's energy from renewable sources by 2000, and he had proposed a set of policies designed at my laboratory that were calculated to achieve that goal. In his best-known energy speech, President Carter said, "Our decisions about energy will test the character of the American people and the ability of the President and the Congress to govern. This difficult effort will be the moral equivalent of war, except that we will be uniting our efforts to build and not destroy." He was right. It was a test. And fortunately, the test is not over yet. In contrast to energy, the functions performed by the IBM personal computer were elementary word processing and creating Lotus 123 spreadsheets. In January 1981, it was absolutely clear to me that America stood on the brink of a technological revolution, but it was an energy revolution, not an information revolution. 26 years later, the scope and consequences of the information revolution are staggering. My laptop has more computation capacity by far than was available to mission control in Houston when we first landed on the moon. And my laptop runs for 3 hours on a battery the size of a pack of cigarettes. The world is covered with a web of terabit per second optical fibers that allows us to send a 500-page book filled with pictures to Bangalore faster than you can blink your eye. Remember that Hurley-Hayes smart modem that transmitted 300 bits per second? A terabit is a trillion bits. We're now going 3 billion times faster. eBay and Amazon have transformed the retail experience. Google and Wikipedia have displaced most reference books. Censorship is on its way to becoming impossible. Privacy, alas, is on its way to becoming an archaic term with no contemporary relevance. I could, of course, go on and on and on, most emphatically about the recent drift away from self-contained, high-powered distributed microcomputers to reliance on an astonishingly intelligent, interactive, all-pervasive network depending on a relatively small number of giant complexes with hundreds of petabytes of storage, the global information cloud. The information revolution is a real revolution, and it's still accelerating. Meanwhile, renewable energy has advanced to approximately the stage that I'd expected it to achieve by 1985. And even that progress has been due almost entirely to the Japanese, Danes, Germans, Australians, and Canadians. The similarities between these two fields are striking. Both of them see their growth occur right at the cusp of where exciting science meets quality engineering. In 1980, both fields were highly centralized. When I left CERI, it had one computer, a Control Data Cyber 76. It filled a small climate-controlled room. Virtually everything that we used it for can be done today on a smartphone. Energy facilities, whether oil fields or power plants, were similarly concentrated. Both fields enjoyed major benefits, perhaps transitory in both cases, of distributed power. With distributed intelligence, we developed smart appliances, smart cars, smart industrial processes. With distributed energy, we avoided transmission costs and achieved enhanced resiliency. A power source next door is worth very much more than an identical power source in the next state. So, why did the information revolution blossom while the energy revolution was still born? What lessons can those of us who care about climate and energy learn from the information revolution? These questions probably deserve a semester course, but let me try to say something useful, or at least provocative, in just a few minutes. The federal government, perhaps inadvertently, contributed the essential building blocks of the information revolution. The Department of Defense and NASA had enough demand for really, really, really expensive chips to convert them into cheap commodities, generating adequate revenues to sustain Moore's Law. I'm going to hopefully have that missing slide in just a moment, which will run you down that list. ARPANET was developed entirely by the federal government, nobody thinking that it was going to develop into the Internet. The Federal Reserve pumped out cheap money throughout the 1990s, prompting the irrational exuberance that allowed the private sector to do things that made no economic sense. For example, it built the worldwide infrastructure for the cloud network years before there was any content to fill it. The visionary companies mostly crashed and burned, taking their investors down with them, but the dark fiber was acquired for peanuts by other firms, and it's slowly getting lit. On the other hand, the federal government consciously set out to destroy the renewable energy industry and to eliminate funding for basic research that could propel it into a world-changing force. Okay, I know, that sounds paranoid, but it happened. In the spring of 1981, the Reagan administration completely dismantled the nation's renewable energy program. They fired 2/3 of my staff at CERI on one day, fired all of its contractors, including CLU that went on to win Nobel Prizes in other fields, slashed my budget by 80%. The basic approach has characterized Bush 1, Clinton, and Bush 2 as well. The American photovoltaic industry, which produced more modules than the rest of the world combined in 1980, was not a significant factor on the world stage by 2000, purely as a result of public policy choices. Interestingly, I came across last week a list of the world's 10 largest photovoltaic companies as of today. America does not have one of them. China has 2 of them, and neither of those Chinese companies existed 5 years ago. This is the result of policies to encourage things. And these policies in particular were Japan and Germany. Japan took photovoltaics when we walked away from it and kept it alive with what they called the Sunshine Program, slowly building the manufacturing capacity. The 4 largest PV firms in the world are still Japanese, and Sharp, which dominates the industry, is Japanese. And then a few years ago, Germany developed its feed-in tariff, which is too complicated to explain to a general audience unless somebody asked me a question about it, but I'd be happy to tell you it. It's been a fantastic thing that has caused Germany, which has a worse solar climate than Grand Rapids, to become by far the world's leading solar manufacturer today, solar installer today. Okay, this is the chart that I showed you before of transistors per chip. And here is the thing that wasn't there before. This is the price in 1962. Say 1958, it was up way over $100 a chip. And as they drove the volume up, according to that slide that you saw just a moment ago, let's see if we can do this. As the volume went up in this period between there up to about there, you had the government buying less and less and less of it. It starts off 100% up through 1962, and then as the price falls, the government buys less and less and less. I couldn't get the NASA figures. NASA would be several percentage points in some of those out years as well. But it was a decision to buy this stuff, even though there was no market for it whatsoever in the private sector, until finally it got down to the point where the private sector took off and started running with it. That's what we should have done with solar. It's sort of what happened with solar. In 1981, when the great dismantling took place, it was $27 per peak watt. Today it's about $4 per peak watt. What happened was that Japan and Germany stepped in, and in a slightly less coordinated fashion than we had hoped to do under the Carter administration, kept driving up the volume relentlessly, and the price has fallen again on this 20% learning curve. I'm now getting toward the end of this thing where it's a little bit of a grab bag of thoughts that I wanted to toss out to you. This one is because about half of the audience here were people who are drawn from academia. And this is a disturbing slide, not quite as disturbing as the next slide, but it gives you some sense of a development that does not bode well for a country that hopes to be at the cusp of a leading technological revolution. And this is what happened to American PhDs in physics. We had, in some very large measure, a Sputnik phenomenon. It was closely tied to the Kennedy administration, and it then fell off the edge. Students tend to want to do things that are interesting and exciting and show promise for the future. And that was a time when space exploration looked like it was going to be the future. With the great growth in sustainability now, I'm hopeful that we're going to be seeing a rebirth across the board in terms of the sciences as well. But as of the last figures that I was able to get my hands on, we're still not doing very well. It's interesting, if you take a look at American students as they're graduating from high school, we're not particularly competitive worldwide. By the time that we graduate from college, we're pretty competitive with people across the planet. And if you go to American graduate schools, these are broad generalizations, but there's some data to back them up. By the time you get to graduate schools, we have almost certainly the best graduate engineering in the world. What has been happening is that a huge fraction of the world is sending their best students to get our best graduate engineering and coming back to do the science in their countries. That's historically been a huge source of innovation for the United States because they got those degrees and were able to hang around. Now, increasingly, they are choosing to go back to where they see a brighter prospect for some of the things that they want to do. And this, we're getting toward the end now, is one of the things that is a continuing source of distress for me. It's development assistance as a share of gross national product, or in this case, gross national income. The United States is right down there. This is only government, and we have a great deal of charity that goes on outside of government including a lot from religion. But if you tack that in, that's also true for a great many other countries, and it would still get us only into somewhere around that range if you included it. To the extent that what we are coming to in energy is a realization that, that the world is interlinked and interdependent, that if you're talking about a unit of carbon dioxide that goes into the atmosphere, it simply makes no difference who emits it. The atmosphere doesn't care. Then we need to be not only developing superior technologies ourselves for our use, but we need to be deploying them rapidly to the rest of the world, including to those poorest parts of the world that are increasingly developing in energy-intensive ways fairly rapidly. And a change in this. And also, I realize I'm at a Catholic institution. I may well get myself in real trouble for this. But I'm going to say it anyway because I believe it so firmly. 8 billion, we've got a chance. 10 billion, things are kind of rough. If we have more than 10 billion people on the world, it's very difficult to figure any way that you can live on the flows of energy to the planet with the amount of land and stuff that we have available to us. America played a very important role at the last UN population conference in 1994, came back with a series of policies that would have been just terrific in terms of empowering women and making birth control information and materials available to anyone who wanted it. In that fall's election, Jesse Helms became the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and those meticulously worked out agreements were all dead on arrival. It's another one of those places where, as part of this chart, that contributes nothing. And the final thought in this stylized view of Mahatma Gandhi is something that we all need to bear closely in mind, and that I guess I should say one of the things I most admire about Peter Wege and the Wege Foundation is that it's very easy to talk about all of this stuff in terawatts and billions of barrels and what have you. But in the end, our personal behavior, the choices that we make in our own homes, our own families, our businesses, our colleges, or what have you, is ultimately what really counts. You can stand behind a microphone and say everything in the world, but if you're not leading a life that has a high degree of integrity to it, if you're not trying to live the life that you're trying to convince the rest of the planet to adopt, then you will necessarily fail. Fortunately, across the country, we are seeing more and more and more LEED-certified buildings. People are buying Priuses faster than anyone can make them. We're seeing people changing their diets. We're seeing people, for environmental reasons, deciding to have only 1 or 2 kids instead of 4 or 5 kids. It's beginning to happen. The race is there to be won. President Carter's test is still being filled in, and I hope all of you will join in helping us pass. Thank you. If that didn't provoke some questions, or comments, or criticisms, or anything, please. Yes.
Yes, I have one. I was very much impressed. I was very much impressed by stressing population control and so on and so forth. But I remember back in the 50s when you were a student in urban design, we took into consideration looking at the social effects that usages were required, changes in usages were required. For example, transportation from one point to the other. If we could build an urban center and an education center and an industrial center that had common factors such as transport and energy generation and that. And I was wondering, has anybody ever taken that into consideration from the old timers to look, if you built and incorporated these urban concepts, how many terawatts would we use less than now anticipated?
Really good question, and it's become an enormously influential part of urban planning and urban design. There's the Congress of New Urbanism. There's the smart growth movement. We've seen in cities across the country a series of policies that are designed to bring people to live right in the urban core including letting them live in areas that in the past were, because they were filled with toxic substances or whatever, places that people didn't want to be building on brownfields. Increasingly, we're figuring out ways to clean them up. In a few cases, simply pave them over with something that's impermeable, but bringing people in where they can avoid those endless commutes and all of the energy that is consumed in it. These things get really complicated. We recently did an analysis in Seattle of the cost of boring a tunnel for part of the light rail system that we wanted to run north, and the amount of energy that it would take to drill the tunnel versus the amount of energy that would be saved by taking cars off of the road. And assuming that America didn't change its fleet, that we had the same miles per gallon and the same sort of way that people are currently driving their cars, mostly one per vehicle, it would take 83 years to pay back that energy. And I don't know anybody that thinks that the automobiles 83 years from now are going to be averaging 19 miles per gallon. So, in fact, you'll never pay back that energy, and most of the drilling is going to be doing with things that will produce carbon dioxide. So you want to do the analysis, you want to be careful, you want to do the right stuff, but there's almost nothing that you can do that makes urban areas more dense that doesn't significantly save energy. And it always comes as a great shock in Manhattan that they are one of the most environmentally benign parts of the United States for that reason.
Thank you. Could you tell the future of photovoltaics, especially thin film photovoltaics versus traditional crystalline, polycrystalline? I don't know if the audience knows, you probably do know, but about 25 miles from here, there's a number of people from Greenville, Michigan. There's several plants going up, United Solar Ovonic, that will be the largest footprint in the world of manufacturing continuous thin film solar cells, the same that are on the Jarecki Center here.
Yes, Stan Ovchinsky, a local inventor living in Troy, was the first person to really explain the science behind a number of things that you can do with amorphous materials, including some interesting designs for batteries, for energy storage, and for other things. One of them is solar cells, and his amorphous solar cells have been out. I mean, Stan was manufacturing these things back when I was at SERI in 1980, and it's one of those people who could have taken advantage of something if there had been the right support structure there, and there simply wasn't. He has, time after time after time, found investors and found banks that would underwrite things with loans and put together this new venture. A charismatic, genuinely brilliant, largely untutored in terms of formal education guy who, if he were a professor at Cambridge, would very possibly have had a Nobel Prize by now. Instead, he's been an entrepreneur, and had he chosen to go into the information business instead of the energy business, he would be a billionaire. The difference between thin films generically, and you can do it out of amorphous silicon, you can do it out of a variety of compound semiconductors, and the crystalline silicon, it's more rigid things that we typically think of as solar panels, is that the crystalline cells are much more efficient than thin films are right now. They also are more materials intensive, so that you have to put more energy into refining, for example, the silicon that goes into them because there's more of the material there than a thin film would be. Some of the thin films are really, really, really thin, laid out on glass. They're just astonishingly non-material intensive. But by and large, they have historically been relatively inefficient, 7, 8, maybe 9% efficiency typically. And historically, including amorphous silicon, tended to degrade fairly badly, particularly during their first few years. But the research continues. Significant improvements have been made over the course of the last quarter century, as you'd expect. And some of the really big money is now going into that realm. There's an interesting point that I had meant to make earlier, and I didn't. When the government got past that level of subsidies in computer chips, it didn't have to do subsidies anymore. At that point, when the marketplace began absorbing these things and they weren't going to depend upon congressional appropriations and other whimsical things, but upon a genuine market, then suddenly venture capitalists started jumping into it and investment bankers, and we built this huge structure of it. We've sort of gotten there now with solar cells. The price of both thin films and single crystalline and polycrystalline solar cells now are sufficient that in a German system they are enormously economic. I mean, the demand is in fact so high that prices have not dropped as costs have dropped because there's more demand than there is supply, particularly this year and last year because of a shortage of refined silicon. We'll say we are now at that crossover point. It's going to be this year that we're going to use more refined silicon in solar cells than we're using in computer chips. And so the industry just didn't anticipate that growth rate. Silicon shortages are not going to be a problem. Silicon is the second most abundant material in the Earth's crust. But refined silicon has been a problem. We're building a ton of new refineries, interestingly, most of them in the United States. And that problem will be over by the end of this year. So it's a question, do you want to have a huge area of land with relatively inefficient, very cheap cells on it, or a smaller footprint with things that are very efficient and guaranteed to last probably for a longer period of time? And the way it's likely to sort out is that you're going to be seeing, in cheap areas like the desert in the Southwest, I think a lot of thin film arrays. And in places where you're trying to have a decentralized footprint and get as much of your own electricity as you can off of the stuff on your roof, you're going to be willing to pay the price of the somewhat more expensive but far more efficient cells there. I could change everything that I've just said in the next 3 to 5 years, depending upon some research that's going on, but that's my current read on it. This is one of those places where nanotechnology could absolutely transform the world around us. Yes?
You focus mostly on the question of supply side management and planning as opposed to demand side reduction. And you're probably familiar with a study that was done in 1986, Energy for a Sustainable World by Bob Williams at Princeton, Emil Reddy, Joseph Goldenberg, and Thomas Johansson from Brazil. And you showed the figures of current power use in the United States and gave the figure of 12 kilowatts.
Per capita.
Yeah. In the Energy for a Sustainable World study, they argued that you could have the lifestyle, or not necessarily the lifestyle, but the high quality of life that we have in the United States at roughly 2 kilowatts. Can you comment on, there's certainly a parallel between the fact that we've gone in the opposite direction from the suggestions that that study showed in terms of energy consumption per capita, and there may be some parallels between your argument about computer production and PV and these larger questions in terms of energy use in general.
Perhaps. To get to the 25 terawatt figure, it would assume that Americans are probably something on the order of 3 kilowatts each. I mean, it would be a significant improvement probably in our current lifestyle, but dramatic increases in the efficiency with which we do things. I mean, you can have everything in that lamp up there that is currently blinding me produced in theory with probably 5% of the energy that goes into it, and in practice with things that we currently have with less than a fifth of the energy that currently goes into it. And there's no loss of anything. You can have the full spectrum. You can have any kind of qualitative element that you want. You just have to do it with the right things. There are some problems with analyses, and candidly, I did one myself that was a precursor. At least I was directing one that was a precursor to the Williams et al. Study. And what you do is you choose the best of the things that are out there and then sort of expand that to say, and the entire nation should do this. And we're a whole bunch of really feisty people who sometimes don't act in our own best interest, so regardless of what the price is, you don't do it. In part, some people are more competent than others. If Amory Lovins wants to build a house in Snowmass that basically produces more energy than it consumes, he can do it. He has windows in it that on the north side of the house get more energy from sunlight that hits snow on the north and reflects into the house than is lost conductively through the window going the other direction. I mean, and that's using materials that were, again, available in the late 1970s, heat mirror. Most people don't do it. We've had this stuff forever, and it's not being incorporated. My sense is that, one, a vast public education activity ought to be taking place, but two, there's also a role for policy. Philips now has made a policy judgment as a company that it's not investing in any more incandescent lights manufacturing facilities, and it's dramatically boosting its production of compact fluorescents. It actually is going to be working in a number of states to ban incandescent bulbs, to phase in a ban perhaps by 2012, and being fought like crazy by a couple of other lighting companies. Not on the general principle, but on the timetable. Philips says they can hit it, and GE thinks they can hit it shortly thereafter. The odds are the ban will happen shortly thereafter, but you have to have those sets of constraints out there. Fundamentally, though, regardless of the constraints, if you look at the price of oil 5 years ago, that was not much of an incentive to anyone to be conserving energy. And if you're not getting the right price signals, then almost anything else that you do produces kind of second-order effects. You have to have prices that allow people to act in their own self-interest when they're making energy choices. And the way we should have done that is, for example, like all of Europe and Japan did, by putting tariffs on imported oil and putting taxes, much higher taxes on gasoline. I mean, you don't see Hummers in, say, Italy. And you pull into a service station in Italy and say, fill her up. That can be like a $240 gas tank bill. If the prices are such, you just don't do certain things. Any others? Yeah, excuse me.
Another trade-offs question. For instance, the incandescent versus fluorescent debate. I've been hearing the primary con with that is how do you recycle fluorescent? What do you do with that gas? In other words, if we come up with a solution, how many problems are we creating with some of the solutions?
Very, very good question. And there were a whole bunch of problems with compact fluorescents when they first came in. Those of you who were early adopters will remember the old magnetic ballast. You'd put them in a desk lamp, and the lamp would just collapse on the desk because they weighed so much. We've gotten past almost all of those problems now, except the one that you referenced, which is to have a fluorescent lamp, you have to have mercury vapor. And mercury vapor is not something that you want to have hanging around society very much. It is not a very difficult task to set up a recycling program to recycle it. And in fact, in Seattle, we have one. In several cities, they have one. But it's not very good. I mean, I've now had 3 compact fluorescents burn out, and I haven't done the analysis, but if I bicycle down to deliver it to the store that will accept them for $1 a piece and recycle the mercury in it, I may be coming out and still an energy. If I climb in my car and drive to the store, I'm probably using more energy than I'm saving by having the lamp there. You need to make them part of an overall curbside recycling program. This is actually one of the more spirited battles that I've ever been involved with. I will not bore you with the horrifying details, but I was deeply engaged in an effort to bring curbside recycling to America at a time when a large fraction of the largest Earth days in the country were being put on by ecology centers that got most of their budgets from people bringing in their cans and bottles of newspapers and recycling them at the And it was a terrible strategy because, one, you'd never get more than 3 or 5% of the public to do that. 2, they'd waste a huge amount of energy doing it. You want to have it so that people can just move it out to the curbs. And that has all sorts of ricochet advantages, including your neighbors know whether you're recycling or not. In fact, in Seattle right now, we're going to sound like a Stalinist police state the way that I'm describing these things. We actually have inspectors that go around, look in your garbage cans for things that can be recycled. And if it's in the garbage can, you can get a $50 fine. I mean, round of applause for Stalinist police states. That's it. Suffice it to say, this is a really big issue, and we shouldn't have any of these bans until we've got good, effective recycling programs there, and I'm confident that they're not going to happen until we have good, effective recycling programs in place. He was, I guess, first. Excuse me. Back there.
I think this is the last question. Thank you. I think that what we're going to see is that with the LED lighting being more and more energy efficient, more productive, that's going to take over before the compact fluorescents really get full steam. But what I wanted to ask, I like Gandhi's quote up there on the board, and if you were to make one suggestion to all the people here in this room and to all the people that maybe are going to get this information, maybe through the newspapers or whatever today, short of conserving gasoline and oil and that sort of thing, what's the number one thing, the change that we can do in our daily lives to have the most positive impact on our energy future here in America?
Yeah, I hate to do this with the last question. Maybe we can have one more question. But I'm going to be ornery. People have been asking me that stuff for the last many decades, and it's a phony question. There is no magic bullet. There's just a whole bunch of things, and unless we're doing them all, we're not going to make it. I mean, for me, there's nothing that's more important than choosing the size of your family, because that's a thing that's going to be moving out forever into the future. We have our greatest dependence for oil for transportation. If you're driving something that is getting anything under, I'd say, 30 miles per gallon, no matter what, whether you need a truck, whether you need, you can find something that is getting at least that mileage, and you have to be pushing out to the most efficient vehicle in the class of whatever it is that you legitimately need. Most people don't think very much about their diets, but diets, food in the United States is enormously energy intensive. We fly this stuff all over the place. Buy things that are organic and that are locally grown. That doesn't mean you can't have coffee and you can't have bananas, but you need to make that step in the right direction. Buildings are incredibly important. It's an area where the technology is just amazing. You can now design smart buildings that can do just damn near anything and make them super efficient. And you should be doing that. And if they're not as efficient as you expect, find out what's wrong and get them fixed. We had in Princeton, at least 20 years ago, I think it was 12 houses that were identical with the same blueprints put up by builders. And it turned out when they normalized them and had the same kinds of activities taking place in them over time, that there was like a factor of 3 difference in the house. And it wasn't because somebody took a lot of hot showers and because somebody else wanted to have the temperature much higher than they were operating essentially the same, but using vastly more energy. And they went in. It was the same guy, Bob Williams, that did the other study that went into, and a whole team with him, to find out what the problems were. And it's workmanship. It's somebody leaves a half-inch gap 40 feet across that isn't insulated. And it turns out if you can have the right kind of quality control there, you can do amazing things. And if there are small little things, in this case it turned out one of the greatest ingredients were who did what on what day of the week. If they came in on Monday and were still hungover, the quality was just terrible. If they were doing it, in the middle of the week when they were basically sobered up again, pretty good stuff. I'll say a final thing, and then I guess maybe I have rattled on long enough that people need to get to dinner. But, well, 2 things. One, the narrow thing, and then a concluding statement. The narrow thing is we continue to build our buildings on site, and it's really hard to get everybody everywhere to have the same concern for craftsmanship and detail. And I think what's going to happen almost certainly is that as energy becomes more and more expensive and we really pay attention to our dwellings and our workplaces, that this stuff is going to be done with high-quality control in manufactured buildings, and they're just going to be put together in innovative ways that are still beautifully and architecturally designed, but that they just slam and they are really tight shut. We would never think of building cars in hundreds of cities across the country. You do this stuff where you can control the quality, and I think that's what's going to happen there. And that will make it a whole lot easier in terms of your behavior, because it's very much like efficient lights. You can get much the same sort of advantages if you get people to turn off their lights when they don't need them. It's infinitely easier to get them to buy super efficient bulbs and to change behavioral things, and refrigerators and televisions and what have you. I keep coming up with little tiny things. One little tiny thing that is really big right now, so I probably should say it because it's just growing explosively, is plasma screen TVs. For heaven's sakes, don't buy a plasma screen TV. If you've got to have a thin TV, and there are advantages to thin TVs, use a liquid crystal display and go to a source that you trust, like the NRDC report of it, and get a super efficient one. The differences there can be like 5-fold in the amount of electricity that it uses for sets that are just about impossible to tell the difference between. And then the final thing. It's now 37 years after that first Earth Day. It was vastly bigger than I'd expected it to be. We thought we'd have maybe 3 to 5 million people. The Associated Press came up with a 20 million figure and a pretty good rationale for it. Mayor Lindsay gave us 6th Avenue. He basically shut it down with police barricades. We filled it with people. Gave us the Great Lawn in Central Park. The crowd estimate in Manhattan was over 1 million people. And Manhattan's not a bad place for that to happen because it had NBC and CBS and ABC and the New York Times and Time and Newsweek. So those are the photographs that were going to hit the news. And it resonated with people in Grand Rapids and every place else that were participating in it across the country. It was a shared communal event that made possible a wave of things, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, on and on. You know the litany. For about 5 years, we were on an incredible roll, and people genuinely cared about this because it was immediate and it was affecting them and affecting their children. The whole thrust of the stuff that you've been hearing today and what was the thrust of my presentation tonight is that we now, as a movement, helped by that information revolution that makes it possible to talk to people around the world and to care about people with an immediacy around the world, is that we are genuinely interdependent. America can't solve climate change. It has to be part of the solution. Ideally, I'd love to have us lead the way, but we then have to share that really ambitiously with everybody else. And that concern that in 1970 motivated, frankly, mostly women. The best Earth Day organizers, almost without exception across the country, were sort of middle-class, college-educated women who were in one-wage earner families and cared a lot about their kids, never done anything political before in their lives and got out on this issue because they cared about their kids and their family and their neighborhoods. We've got to take that same thing now in this heroic leap forward, not only for human beings, but for those polar bears and for the orangutans. There are now already more tigers in zoos than there are tigers outside of zoos. We need to develop a consciousness of the need for health of the whole planet and move aggressively to do it. And I'm absolutely confident that, aided by the revolution that did take place in the information world, we can now accomplish the revolution that should have taken place in the energy world. Thank you.